So let me basically get started. And yeah, this is, so in some sense, I'm trying to frame this. It's not a typical seminar which would be going into deep depth into one paper. I am trying to take a slightly bigger picture view based on this 10 years of work. But at the same time, I don't want to become a talking head. We have too many talking heads like me who talk big thoughts without diving deep into data. So I am going to expect you to work. By work, I mean stay awake and follow through the rigor of some of the arguments and some of the designs. And I am going to summarize about 5 or 6 academic papers. And so, we'll see how this goes. Okay? So, in terms of the motivation, the past 10 years, the good news has been that after decades of neglected primary education, I think starting in the 90s, the government and policymakers woke up to the importance of primary education. And between DPEP and SSA and now building up to the RTE, you have seen significant progress, at least on access in terms of number of kids who now have a school within half a kilometer, and in terms of enrollment. So the enrollment numbers now look nice. And we've got this 96% enrollment number. Now, in a funny way, of course, RTE being launched at a time when 96% of kids are in school, in many ways, most people in villages, as Yamini was just telling me this morning, we think about RTE as, this means we can force kids to come to school. But in a way, thinking about this in terms of access, at this point is almost a bit like the police arriving in the last scene in the Hindi movie after all the action is over, right? And so in some sense the action is already moved. The action is moved beyond access to now kind of where the half empty side of the glass is, which is what you see on this side. And again, it's really appropriate that Pratham's co-sponsoring this because, in terms of moving the national dialogue on education towards learning outcomes, perhaps nobody has done as much as what Pratham has done over the past 5 years. And so this is just taking the data from the most recent ASER, or maybe this is the one just before that. But basically 19% of kids in grade 1 don't read at the grade 1 level, and almost 60% of children aged 6 to 14 are not able to read a simple paragraph. And so it really kind of begs the question about what is it that we're trying to do with our education system if all we're doing is putting kids through school, but without in fact learning much. Okay? Now, the traditional story, of course, has been that, we're a poor country, we're not spending enough on education, and as long as we get this spending up to this holy grail of 6% of GDP, you fund RTE fully, you provide the facilities, provide the teachers, this is going to take care of itself. But at least if you look at the trends in the past 6 years, this doesn't seem to be happening the way we would hope it would have, right? So, the expenditure numbers are steadily climbing, and in fact, this is only SSA, this does not include the state budgets, and as Yamini will again tell you, it's kind of non-trivial task to actually put these numbers together to even figure out what the budget numbers are. The bottom line is spending has been going up, and as Pratham has been documenting year after year, we're pretty much seeing flatlining of learning outcomes. And so that's the milieu we are in, and that's the backdrop, which is there is increase in spending, and we're doing as much as, we're doing all the prescribed things on the input side, but you're not seeing action on the outcomes. Now, this is a very, very important picture. It's kind of a one-slide summary of an influential paper done by Rick Hanishek and Ludger Vosman, looking at the cross-country determinants of growth. And in the growth literature, a lot of this, of course, is not the most empirically rigorous work, given that it's cross-country. But the one robust fact has usually been that education, or years of education, has typically been robustly correlated with growth. And so that's something that comes out of the Barrow-Lee work. So what they're doing is they're basically revisiting Barrow-Lee, but not just looking at quantity of education, but including measures of quality of education, where the quality is now measured by TIMSS and PISA scores. And now what you see is that the traditional relationship with an upward gradient between years of education, the average years of education, and growth, basically becomes flat once you control for quality. And the action completely shifts to the quality margin, right? And so where the growth human capital relationship shows up is much more on quality of education as opposed to quantity. And the reason this really matters is to the extent that the stated policy priority for government is inclusive growth, human capital and investments in human capital are central to both parts of that agenda, right? So at one level, there is what human capital means for aggregate growth, which is this, and then on the other level, we all know that one of the reasons that we worry so much about education is that that is the passport to a better life and to allow children to participate in the growth process that the modern economy is generating. Okay, so this should tell you why we need to focus on quality. But, and then going back into the story of why might we not be translating inputs into outcomes, a fundamental gap here again is governance, which is the process by which the spending gets translated into outcomes. And I'm really sorry for calling out Yamini 3 times in 5 minutes, but, we had breakfast together like today and we went through a bunch of numbers. And, she's been doing some very, very nice work, and the PESA initiative, looking at how funds are flowing through the system. But in some sense, the most glaring part of the accountability gap is what's going on with teachers, right? Because teachers account for 90% of the spending. And this is the work we did back in 2003, finding that on any given day, about 25% of teachers are absent and about half the teachers are not teaching. And the team that in fact did that work is also here in the audience. So, there's lots of different threads kind of being tied together here. Now, in that sense, I could present an entire separate paper on this, and the team that worked on this is also here. But the most depressing part of this is that we've now gone back to the same villages, okay, 7 years after that initial round of work was done. 1,500 villages, nationally representative sample, 19 states, 80 villages per state, 1,500 villages, and basically you saw what that spending graph looked like, but the preliminary results find absolutely no change in national teacher absence. Okay, and this is not just from the nationwide work. If you look at the work we've been doing in Andhra Pradesh, where we're following these schools every year, visiting them 6 times a year, that absence number seems almost like a gravitational constant that doesn't change. That number has not changed, and so that's where we are. Now, one part of this dialogue has focused on absence, governance, and effort of teachers. But I think there's another part of the story which is increasingly emerging, from the work that Pratham is doing, as well as other studies that are supporting this. And this is the fact that, if you look at not just learning levels, but look at learning trajectories, okay? So the traditional cross-sectional, even USER data will tell you that maybe 60% of kids at the end of class 5 are able to do single-digit addition. Now, what we've got in our AP data is that we are following a set of 10,000 kids in a representative sample of schools over 5 years, right? So now we are measuring not only levels of learning, but measuring trajectories of learning to see what is happening for every additional year that you're spending in school. And what you see is really quite striking, right? If you take a simple single-digit addition question like this that belongs in the first standard curriculum, you see that only about 65%, about 1/3 of kids cannot do this question even at the end of class 5. But 1/3 of them are able to do this at the end of class 2. And so it's this flat line that is particularly worrisome, right? Because what this is telling you is if you look at this gap, okay, this is say 65% of kids don't know this. Less than 20% of the kids who don't know something are learning it from spending another full additional year in school, right? Do you see that? So if you look at the gap of what fraction of kids don't know something at the end of class 2 and how many of them learn it from spending another full year in school, that number is typically less than 20%, okay? And so this suggests that it cannot just be a story of absence. And this is much more preliminary work. We don't have really rigorous evidence, but I think a lot of field-based anecdotes are suggesting that we need to get into the classroom and see what is a good teacher doing, right? Because forget the absence. What does a good teacher do? Okay, a good teacher comes to class and defines his or her mission as I have to complete the portion. Okay, so this is how a good teacher thinks of their work plan, right? So the entire textbook is then mapped into weekly lesson plans, monthly lesson plans. You come, you do your stuff, and that's how you know you're a good teacher, but you're going ahead at the rate of the syllabus regardless of where the kids are, okay? And what this data is starting to suggest very strongly is that once you have a culture of automatic promotion, now I don't want to get into the detention debate, I'm just pointing out the consequences of that, is that children are reaching higher grades without having mastered basic stuff, and at that point they're just lost. So it doesn't matter whether you're teaching, once you're in 3rd or 4th standard without having mastered 1st grade material, it doesn't matter whether you're teaching 4th or Greek, right, because the kids are lost, okay? I'm just using some of this to motivate some of the big picture issues here. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about today is based on very, very detailed work we've been doing in Andhra Pradesh for the past 6 years. And this is a project known as the Andhra Pradesh Randomized Evaluation Study, which is a partnership between the government of Andhra Pradesh, the Azim Premji Foundation, the World Bank, and DFID. And the project started really as a consequence of the first round of absence work. In fact, it was at that GDN conference in 2004 when I was presenting that the first time, that the then Principal Secretary of Education in AP, who was somebody who was not just an administrator, but had a PhD in education, Dr. Subbarao, might be known to some of you here. He was the person who basically initiated this program, what we call the Andhra Pradesh Randomized Evaluation Study. And this had 3 broad objectives, okay? The first one is It sounds ridiculously obvious, but it's really hard to do in practice. But the first is just to systematically move the focus of education policy from outlays towards outcomes. And this involves measurement, not just of levels, but of trajectories of learning. And the graph I showed you was one illustration of, of something like that. Okay? So the first objective here is focus on outcomes. The second is to then focus very systematically on the incentives and motivation of teachers who are the frontline service providers in this system. Okay? So there's multiple reasons for focusing on teachers. The first is that there's a lot of evidence that shows that teachers are the most important policy variable you have in terms of influencing learning outcomes. But even more importantly, if 90% of non-capital spending is salaries, then improving the effectiveness of teachers by 10% is going to do a lot more than doubling the effectiveness of something that's 1% of the budget, right? And so if you want to focus your policy and research attention, you want to focus it on the part that is the largest component of the budget, because that's where those improvements are going to give you the biggest bang for the buck. Okay? And then the final thing, and this is in some sense, the larger data-driven research agenda, research and policy agenda here, is to improve the empirical orientation of education policy making by rigorous evaluations of what works and relative cost comparisons of different policy options, because in a world of limited resources, you could put 10 experts in a room and you'll get 10 different opinions on what you should be doing, not because any of them are wrong, right? But every expert in some sense is extrapolating from his or her personal experiences and saying that this is what we should be doing, right? So some folks would say, let's get the midday meals done. Some would say, let's get the let's get teacher training done. Some would say, no, it's about attendance. The point is, none of these things are wrong, but in a world of limited resources, you really need some basis of saying which of these are going to give you the highest return on investment of a limited set of resources. So the larger program within which this is embedded is trying to bring analytical rigor into policy making by figuring out the relative cost effectiveness of different policy options. So the design, so there's, how am I doing the time? There's no big clock, right? So, let's see.
You're 10 minutes.
I'll put this guy here. Yeah, that's fine. So perfect. Because we started about 3:40. Right? Okay. So let me, so like I said, this is a multi-stakeholder partnership, and it's one of these Leontief production functions. I'll take the liberty of assuming that there's some economists here, and that this couldn't have happened without any of these parties. Okay, basically, the government of Andhra Pradesh clearly was the key initiator of the project. It wouldn't have happened without them. The Azim Premji Foundation was absolutely essential. They were the entities that carried out the entire project. They are the signatories to the MOU with the government. All the field staff, all the data collection, everything here is done and driven by the Premji Foundation. The World Bank may provide technical support, but frankly, I think the biggest value of the World Bank for any of you who's tried to work with government was the institutional continuity over these 7 years, because we've had 7 principal secretaries in 7 years. So there's no way, any individual or researcher, however committed, could have kept this going for so long without the institutional continuity that was provided by the World Bank. And DFID, again, deserves enormous credit for having a long-term vision and supporting this over the life of the project, and this wouldn't have been possible without any of these parties. Now, so let me take, and maybe this is very obvious to 3 or 4 people, or maybe more than that, but let me take the liberty of spending about 5 minutes just on basic issue of methodology, okay? And what makes what we're doing here kind of reasonably unique, at least in the Indian policy setting, okay? So it turns out that the most difficult question in empirical social science is to isolate the impact of any one particular policy intervention, right? So I was recently in Patna, and everybody in Patna is, all they can talk about is the Chief Minister's bicycle program, right? They see that the girls' enrollment rates have gone up, and they're like, this is the best program since sliced bread, see how our enrollment rates have gone up, okay? But the problem, of course, of using that as the comparison is that in the same time, there are thousands of other things changing at the same time, right? So incomes are changing, attitudes are changing, returns to education are changing, and so maybe you would get this increase anyway, right? So how do you isolate the impact of a particular policy? Turns out to be a remarkably difficult question. So let's take the example of midday meals and just ask, this has probably been the most important nationally scaled up policy in education. What has been the impact of this program? Does anybody know? The answer is no. Okay? Because to begin with, we haven't even typically defined the outcomes. Okay, what are the outcomes we are hoping to impact through this midday meal program? Okay? And typically, even this first step is not undertaken in a concrete way. Okay. Now, let's assume it is, okay, and let's say that the outcomes we're hoping to affect are nutrition, attendance, and then learning outcomes. Did anybody collect baseline data on these characteristics before we launched the program? No. Okay. But let's say you managed to collect baseline data. Would that be good enough? Okay, so suppose you measured outcomes in 2003 when you launched the program, and then you go 5 years later, then is this a valid measure of the impact of the program? And the answer is no, for exactly the reasons I gave you in the context of the cycle program, because thousands of other things are changing at the same time, right? So what you need is a statistically valid control group that would otherwise look identical, except for the fact that a particular place got the particular program, okay? And so what you want to do is you want an appropriate control group so that if this is the overall difference, right, you have a control group that can net out everything else that changed. This could be the income, the demands, the aspirations, and everything else we've talked about, so that you can isolate and say that this difference is attributable purely to this program. Okay? So this is not rocket science. It's basically the most, it's in some sense statistics 101, because if you do the design right, all you have to do is do a simple comparison of means, and you don't need any fancy econometrics. Okay? The challenge, of course, is that, and this is kind of why it's considered the gold standard, at least in clinical research. Now, there are reasons to not consider this the be-all and end-all in social science research, as I noticed Biju's here, and there's a lot of stuff you want to do with qualitative data, understanding processes. But the bottom line is that given that any new major public policy program can almost never be scaled up immediately, right? Any program is going to have a rollout cycle, right? That there's almost no reason to not work systematically with the rollout cycle to try and measure impact, right? By measuring baselines and then looking at differential outcomes, ideally through a randomized phase out or rollout, okay? So what we've done here in this AP-REST project is basically take a series of interventions that education experts and others thinking about the subject would think are policy levers that we have to try and improve the quality of education, and then test each of these in a comparable setting with large-scale randomized evaluations. Okay? So there are 5 broad sets of interventions that we've tested in the first wave of the project. So let me just go through these very quickly. And so in some sense, each of these is a whole paper. Okay, I don't know if Shekhar actually circulated this list of papers, but there's a paper behind every one of these guys. Okay, so the first thing we start with, and I notice there are representatives from education initiatives here, is just a basic intervention of providing diagnostic feedback to teachers. So there's a lot of people who think that part of the reason kids are not learning is that teachers don't know what the kids know and what they don't. They don't know what the appropriate benchmarks are. They don't know what might be appropriate skill groupings of the kids and how might you organize the classroom better. And so this is the detailed diagnostic feedback reports to students were produced by education initiatives, which they have done and deployed in a range of private schools. And their prior was that this would be a highly effective intervention because they have seen teachers use this and use it to understand what's going on in the classroom better. Okay? So broadly, you can consider this as a training and capacity building intervention, though it's not training and capacity building in the strict sense of calling people to a seminar and conducting this, but it's giving teachers very, very detailed feedback reports along with suggestions for how they might modify their teaching practice. Okay? Now, the next set of interventions was basically providing schools with block grants. Okay, so these are just school grants that are provided, and the schools are flexible to spend this however they want. The only condition is we specify that it must be spent on inputs directly used by children. So, because if they were going to do construction projects, A, it would take too long, and B, you would have to evaluate over the depreciation life cycle of the capital good. Okay? So the idea here was you wanted all of these interventions to be flow versus flow comparisons, because these are things that are used up every year. Okay? And sometimes the theoretical background for studying the effectiveness of this kind of block grant comes from work that Lance Pritchard and Dion Filmer did back in 1999, where they showed that over 90% of spending goes to teacher salaries. And so in a world like that, you might think that the marginal returns to non-teacher spending might be much higher. Okay? So basically, that was the next intervention. Now the third intervention was the use of contract teachers, which again, for those of you who are in education policy, has probably been among the single most controversial policy measures in primary education in the past 20 years, correct? And so these are the use of locally hired teachers, typically at the village level, who are almost always less educated and less trained than your government civil service teachers, and they're also paid a pittance, right? They're paid often a fifth of what a civil service teacher makes. And this has been massively controversial about whether or not contract teachers add any value, because one view is that an untrained teacher cannot do anything in the classroom and is basically useless. And then the other question is, so the first question is, does the contract teacher add any value? And second is, how does that compare with what a regular teacher might do? Okay? And then the last set of interventions here, in fact, I realized, we have a nice 15-minute YouTube on this, on the performance-based stuff. But the last set of interventions, and this is really worth reflecting on a little bit more, because this is what came out of the discussions with Dr. Subbarao and the focus groups and everything we had, right? Which is the importance of having some element in a teacher's life that depends on what you do. Okay? And so this was, to my knowledge, perhaps the first serious experiment with performance-linked pay in the public sector, and for sure in government schools. And the idea was that teachers would get a small bonus, not a huge amount of money, okay, and I'll discuss the scheme in much more detail when I get there, but that the average bonus was about 3% of annual pay, okay, so this is not a lot of money. But the point is, for the first time in these teachers' lives, there was something that depended on what they did, as opposed to being essentially a bureaucrat for whom nothing in a professional trajectory depends on what you do, okay? And then when you think about performance pay, there were two versions of this. One was done at the individual level and one was done at the group level. Okay, so the individual performance-based scheme is you, the teacher, get a bonus as a function of the improvement of your kids. And in the group, it is all the teachers in the school get a pooled bonus as a function of how all the kids in the school are doing. And again, I'll discuss this in more detail. Now notice that there is a certain reason of why I have organized this in this particular way, okay? And that's because we are starting from interventions that are basically doing inputs, okay? This blue is not so clearly visible. So these are inputs only, right? I mean, there's nothing here that is conditional in performance. Here is more feedback, here are reports, here is training, here is block grants, okay? Now, the contract teacher is a bit of hybrid because there's an input because it's a physical extra teacher, but it's also not quite business as usual because these contract teachers have different incentives and they're not guaranteed civil service tenure. And then the last thing is performance pay. And the schools that are provided this are not guaranteed the performance pay, right? You are only eligible for the bonuses, but whether you get something depends completely on your performance. So the idea here is to go from business as usual spending on inputs to thinking about what would happen if you were willing to modify how you thought about public expenditure programs. Okay? So, we can go through this in a lot of detail. This is done in Andhra Pradesh. And one thing I want to highlight here is one criticism of experiments, randomized experiments, that usually happens is that experiments take place in small samples and extrapolating beyond the sample becomes quite problematic, okay? So this is, to our knowledge at least, the first time you have random assignment in a representative sample of schools. So every one of 60,000 schools in the state of Andhra Pradesh has the same ex-ante probability of being in the universe of the study, and then conditional on being in the universe of the study, you were equally likely to be assigned to any of these treatments, okay? So normally, people have a hard time keeping their heads separate between random sampling and randomization. Okay, now those are two different things. Okay, so what you see here first is random sampling. Okay, to see which are the schools that are in the study. So again, districts proportional to populations in Telangana, Coastal Andhra, Rayalaseema. The districts are adjacent for logistics purposes. Within a district, you randomly sample 10 mandals, and then in each mandal, you randomly sample 10 schools. Right? So 10 times 10 times 5 gives you a universe of 500 schools, and then each treatment is then assigned randomly to 2 schools in each mandal, so a total of 100 schools per treatment across the state. So that geographical stratification is really important because then you can be sure that no other government program is confounding what you're doing because you're netting out everything with mandal level fixed points. Okay? So I'm assuming this is like part economics. So I'm allowed to go. I took out my slide with partial derivatives, but I'm assuming I'm allowed to go semi-technical. Okay? So let me therefore get now straight to results, and this is the part that's a little difficult because each of these interventions is one full paper. I'm going to try and summarize a paper in 2 slides each. But let me take a pause and ask if there's any clarifying questions on design. Just on the design, are there any clarifying questions? Am I going too fast? Are we doing good? Yes? Front, back, up.
I do people want the lights on in case they're writing notes or something? Would you rather have the lights on? Are you alright with this film theatre style performance? Very good. Thanks.
I wasn't sure if Shekhar giving me the water was a very subtle sign of slow down, take a sip.
No, I was just being gracious.
Yeah, speed has been known to be a problem.
But I was just with Karthik this weekend where his thesis advisor, about 30 seconds after he started speaking, his thesis advisor, Marty Thurston, said, Karthik, slow down.
Okay, so we've got this set up here. Okay, what is it that we're trying to do? And let's go dive straight into the first intervention, which is providing teachers with detailed diagnostic feedback along with low-stakes monitoring, okay? So often people in education will say, we just need to monitor the schools more, we need to go there, we need to visit, we need to do this. But this is low-stakes monitoring, which means that you get visited on average once a month. Somebody comes and sits in your classroom, observes what you do, takes notes, but there is no reward or penalties. That's what I mean by low-stakes, right? A low-stake observation is essentially low-stakes monitoring when nothing is tied to the outcome of the monitoring, okay? Now what you see, it's quite stunning, okay? Because if you were to observe these schools on teaching activity, okay, so again, I've compressed what would have at least been 5 slides into one, but what we've done is we've taken these various measures of teaching activity that we observe, okay? Is the teacher active in the classroom, reading from a textbook, answering questions, calling kids, using a chalk? I mean, there are a lot of these time and motion studies whereby you sit in the classroom and just pick whether you see these things happening, okay? So that's how this is done. So if you were to evaluate the effectiveness of this intervention by your classroom observation, you would conclude that this was a highly effective intervention, okay? Because teachers in these programs were about 0.1 standard deviations more active. Now, let me pause for a minute and just for the non-education specialists in the audience, just quickly tell you why we do everything in education research in standard deviations, okay? And that's because you can't compare two tests. You got 80% in one test, you got 40%, but yours could have been a very easy test and yours could have been very difficult, right? So fundamentally, when we report the results of education research, what is done is to normalize everything by subtracting the mean and dividing by the standard deviation. So everything is reported in z-scores, and so then results across metrics, across tests, across whatever you do are then comparable. Okay, so 0.1 standard deviations is about 4 percentile points of the median of a normal distribution, and so that's what you want to keep at the back of your mind. And when I come to treatment effects, I'll do a little bit more about putting these numbers in context. Okay, but basically the main headline here is if you were to evaluate this by what you measure the teachers doing in class, you would think that this was a highly effective program. Okay, but then at the end of the year, okay, we have another set of control schools where they have no idea that they're going to even be in a study, okay? And all we do is we go and conduct a surprise test in 100 schools completely outside the project. And then there are these 100 schools, okay, that got the feedback, got the monitoring, got all of this done. And you basically see that there is absolutely zero difference in student learning, okay, between these two sets of schools. Okay? So the only way to reconcile this, or how do you square this circle, is the lack of impact on test scores despite enhanced teaching activity suggests that it's very easy for a teacher to temporarily change behavior when you're under observation. When somebody's coming and watching you, you pick up your chalk, you're on your best behavior. In fact, it's very interesting, right? If you look at these various measures, the one measure that these schools do worse are the children asking questions. Right? Because when somebody goes to the classroom, you automatically have an impulse to take charge and show that you're in control. Okay, and so what it suggests, it's got both a point about this particular intervention as well as a point about research methodology. Okay, now the point about the intervention is, see, this was not a bogus intervention. This was not something that we thought would not have an effect. In fact, if you ask EI, and we've got people from there right here, they would tell you that schools absolutely swear by this. Okay. So what happened? And the fundamental difference is that the schools where EI was used to deploying this product were private schools that had paid for the product and were demanding the product and therefore were going to use it. So based on that interaction, it was completely reasonable for EI to think that these are highly valuable reports. Okay? But then you take that same training, that same capacity building intervention and push it in a supply-sided way on a government schooling system where there is nothing in the teacher's life that makes him want to use this. We have a lot of field reports that basically say, when the enumerator was there, report, very nice, and then you go back and basically the reports are sitting locked up in the cupboard all year, because they've not been used. And so, it's really, really important to keep this in mind, and I'll come back when I wrap this up, when I think about the marginal returns to training. See, if you say quality is a function of knowledge and effort, so the partial derivative of quality with respect to knowledge depends on the effort level, right? So anything multiplied by 0 is still 0. So you can ramp up a lot on the capacity side, but if that is not accompanied by a corresponding ramping up on the effort side, your returns are going to be very, very low, So that's kind of the main policy point of this. The research point of this is again just a methodological one, that if you were to base your conclusions based on observations, then that might give you a very misleading picture relative to also going and looking at what happened to outcomes, So that's a lot to pack in one slide, but that's basically an entire paper, that I've just summarized there for you, So let's move to the next one, which is looking at what happened with these block grants, So the first thing you want to see is how did they spend the money? So remember that all of these ran for 2 years. So you had the block grant program, and basically you see that the spending patterns are remarkably similar. About half the money is spent on child stationery. So that's that big yellow bar here, which is notebooks, slates, chalks, etc. And another 30 or 40% was spent on classroom materials. That's about 20%. And on practice books, workbooks, exercise books, and stuff like this. And, this is what you would expect. The teachers were delighted. Everybody was very happy to get the grant. They bought the material. So, one thing, you might wonder, I hope I have the animation right. Anyway, so the bottom line is that the money was spent in remarkably the same way in both years, But now, let's look at the test score results, and there is a big puzzle, And the big puzzle is the following. That in the first year of this program, you get a big significant, so anything in red is significant and green is not, So you get a significant increase in test scores of about 0.09 standard deviations, which is, a non-trivial number. But at the end of 2 years, you continued giving the money. In the second year, you again gave them the money, but the effect actually fell off in the second year, So what do you think happened? Because there are some people who have seen this, so we're not allowed to answer. The total effect. That's the total effect, not just the marginal effect. That's Y2 on Y0. So the marginal effect, in fact, is negative. And in fact, this is basically, if you look at because we know that there is decay in test scores, right? So basically what happens is about half of any annual gain typically decays. So if you break this down into the marginal effect, basically the marginal effect in the second year is 0. Because you've lost half the first year gains to natural decay, and the marginal effect is 0. So the question is, what happened? Now, there are 2 or 3 possible hypotheses that come to mind, The first is a diminishing return story, That somehow you spent on the most important things in the first year, and then after that there weren't as valuable materials to spend on in the next year, Now that turns out to not be true because we've seen that the spending was identical, in both years. The second story that, of course, everybody comes up with, and with good reason, is, corruption. That somehow in the second year they must have figured out a way to steal the money. Some gochi happened. And in fact, we took a lot of care in designing the program to make sure that this would not be the case. Because what we did was, if you want to reduce corruption, you can say, Azim Premji Foundation will centrally procure the material and send it to you. So then we know there's no corruption. But then there's a risk that there's a mismatch between what the school wants and what you're providing, So what we do is the school is given 2 weeks to prepare a list saying this is how much money you're getting. You make a list of everything you would like to buy. And the foundation mandal coordinator and the head teacher, they go jointly and buy the materials, and the materials are then delivered to the school. So that way the school has enough flexibility in what they spend, but they never see the cash, So there's complete audit and control. Now, we did find when we did our audit that the materials reached the school. There was a small fraction of schools where the teachers had negotiated a discount in advance with a shop, and they got a kickback later, for a bulk discount. But once you put all of that together, that still accounted for only 1% of the total spend. So this is not a corruption story. The money got there. Money got there, it was spent well. So what happened? So the answer turns out to be Public Finance 101, which is completely obvious once I tell you, But it's amazingly absent in most of our policy discussions, okay? And the basic idea is what we're doing is we are also measuring household spending, okay, very carefully. And what you see is that in the second year, there is almost a complete one-for-one reduction in the household spending corresponding to the per child value of the grant. Okay? Now, this is completely rational. Okay? So if you write down a dynamic optimization model for what a household would do, in the first year, the grant is unexpected. Okay? It's a surprise. So if you think about when your school spending takes place, it happens at the beginning of the school year, right? That's when you go buy all the notebooks, buy everything, and you send your kid freshly equipped all the way to school. Okay? And the grant arrives 2 months into the school year, which means that the materials procured in the first year are a net addition to the total materials the child has. But in the second year, the grant is anticipated, which means there is enough time to re-optimize household behavior. And so you see this offset. So the net increase in expenditure in the second year is basically zero, which, coming back to Biju's point, gives you a second year effect of close to zero, because the offset is basically close to 100%. Now, this is not to say that this was not a welfare enhancing program, right? Because clearly the households are better off, because the households have not had to spend that money, and we didn't have the, either the time or the budget, or in some sense the statistical power to go and do a 4-hour household survey of where all the spending might have gone. So all we were able to measure is how much did we spend on this child's education. So we know it fell down. But the larger point is that unless you have goods with highly public good characteristics, the long run impact is not going to be very different from the income elasticity of test scores, because things are fungible and then you reallocate across a range of spending. Now, this is again not to say that this should not be done, because it does make the households better off, but if public policy is going to focus on education spending, given that there's distortion to raising taxes and raising public revenue and spending public revenue, there ought to be a focus on goods that have more public good characteristics and that are potentially less substitutable. Okay? So that's the main lesson out of this, and this is where I took out my partial derivative slide, because basically there's this huge literature trying to estimate education production functions, right? I mean, saying what is the impact of public spending on school outcomes, okay? But what it forgets is that a production function parameter is a partial derivative, right? Which is how much the test scores go up when you increase this input, holding everything else constant, okay? Whereas the policy parameter is a total derivative after everybody else is re-optimized, okay? I might as well put the equation out there, okay? But this is the thing in words, okay? Which is when it's unanticipated, the reduction is low, overall spending went up, and test scores went up significantly. When it was anticipated, the larger reduction in household spending, overall spending did not increase, and you got an insignificant increase in test scores. Okay? So again, the point is just to highlight, what a careful systematic research study that looks at all these mechanisms can come back and highlight, because it's not just saying it didn't have an effect, but trying to pin down what the mechanism was, and I already walked. Okay, so how am I doing? Not too bad. Okay? So now let's come talk about the contract teachers. Contract teachers, like I said, are different from regular teachers in practically every observable characteristic. Okay? They are much more likely to be female. They are much younger. Okay? So the regular teachers have about 15 years more experience. Regular teachers have about twice as likely to have a college degree. And this is where the big difference is, okay? So a regular government teacher, almost all of them have some formal teacher training, okay? And this is what RT is enshrining, that this notion that a trained teacher is what you need. And these contract teachers, less than 10% of them have formal training. The other big difference is that most regular teachers live in village or block headquarters and live much further away from the school where they're posted to, whereas the contract teachers over 80% of them are from the same village. And you can see that in the distances, the average distance here is 12 kilometers, and here it's 1 kilometer. And of course, 12 kilometers in rural transport conditions translates to a lot more in terms of time. Okay? And then this is the real kicker, okay, is that the salaries of these contract teachers, this is the average back in 2006, it's higher now, but the difference is, the factor is the same, okay, that the salary is about 1/6 of what a regular teacher makes. And in fact, this is an underestimate, because I'm not including the pension costs, I'm not including the present discounted value of all other benefits that a civil service worker, that a government employee gets, including indexed pensions, okay? And so once you include that, the total difference is more like a factor of 10, okay? So this is a huge, huge number. Now there are several concerns with respect to contract teachers, okay? Now the first and most fundamental one is a very deeply held belief among a lot of education policy makers that using untrained and less qualified contract teachers will not improve that. Okay? So there is this deep belief that this is essentially a bunch of tight fists and Scrooges in the finance ministry, who want to shortchange these poor kids by making you hire contract teachers. If only we hired regular teachers in every school, we would be doing fine. Okay? So that is kind of the concern number one. Concern number two comes from that salary difference I gave you, which is that, this is the second concern. No, third. The second concern is that because these contract teachers go through decentralized hiring, that as opposed to set civil service procedures, that there could be local political capture of these positions. And then this is probably the other big visceral reaction that people have, which is that these contract teachers are exploited, because you're exploiting rural unemployment and you're paying them really low wages, and it's just not fair to pay them so less. Okay? So we're asking two main questions, which is first, what is the impact of an extra contract teacher? Okay, so this is simply addressing the first question, because we're saying, is the marginal product of a contract teacher positive? In a way, it's also addressing the second question, because what we are doing is we are not modifying the process of how these teachers are hired, right? Everything is business as usual, however they are hired. All we are doing is for 100 randomly selected schools, we are relaxing the budget constraint and giving them the budget and saying you can hire a contract teacher, follow your procedures, follow everything you would normally do. Okay? So if there was in fact local elite capture, then you should not see any improvement in learning outcomes. Okay? So this is a business as usual evaluation of an expansion of contract teachers. And the last question, of course, is how would reducing PTR with a contract teacher compare with doing that with a regular teacher? Now, this is done non-experimentally, and I'll tell you how we do that. So here are the first set of results. The first is that we find that students in schools with an extra contract teacher perform significantly better. And for those of you who can't see the numbers, this 0.09 first year effect is basically identical to the block grant effect. Okay? But the second year effect continues to be 0.09. And like I was explaining to Biju just now, in education interventions, you always see decay of about half the gains from year to year. Okay? So it's basically from 0.09, it's like going down to 0.045, and then you added 0.09 and you got back to 0.14 after 2 years. Okay? So basically, the effect of the contract teacher was maintained over this period. The other main thing is in terms of heterogeneity of impact. Okay, where was the differential impact? And what you saw pretty consistently is it's that the remote areas, the more remote you were, the differential advantage of the contract teacher was even higher, the more remote you were, and which makes sense because the regular teacher absence is the highest in the most remote areas, so the relative effectiveness of contract teachers was even higher, the further remote you went, which in some sense are the places that the policy is really struggling to reach. Okay? Now, this is then looking at time on task and absence. Okay, contract teacher absence rates are about 40% lower. Okay, 16% versus 27%. And they're significantly more likely to be teaching when you observe them. But I take this with a grain of salt because, like I just told you, when you go to observe them, they all pick up their chalks and look like they're teaching. Okay, so whereas this is much more reliable because you can't materialize out of nowhere when the enumerator shows up in the school. Okay. So the absence number is probably what I put more stock. Now let's go and look at how do you compare a contract teacher with a regular teacher. And this is where having multiple years of data is really, really helpful. Okay? Because what we have is we can observe the trajectories of students, okay, over time. And the first thing you can do is for every student we know whether they're matched to a regular or contract teacher. And we have their baseline and their end line every year. So you can look at the value added, how much has a student gained in a year, and correlate that with whether they had a contract or a regular teacher. Right? Then what you can do is, over time, you can look at the same child going through the schooling system, okay? And in some years he's going to have a contract teacher, in some years he's going to have a regular teacher. And then what you can do, holding everything else constant, controlling for a bunch of things, holding the number of teachers constant and enrollment constant, you can say does the percentage of contract teachers in the school make a difference, okay? So all of these are different ways of getting at this question of the relative effectiveness of contract and regular teachers. It's not as clean as the experiment, but it is kind of better than any other non-experimental work I've seen on this. And what we see in all three cases, however you cut the data, however you torture the data, whatever you do, you never find that a contract teacher is less effective than a regular teacher. In fact, all the point estimates suggest that the contract teacher is more effective. Some of them are even significantly so. Okay, but I don't even want to make the claim that they're more effective. Okay, the claim that I'm more confident making is that they are no less effective. Okay, but remember that they cost 1/5 or 1/10. And so the correct policy comparison is not 1 versus 1, but 1 versus 5. So if what you care about is maximizing learning outcomes for a given budget, right? Then that is the relevant policy comparison. Now, There are lots of issues, and I'll come back and talk about it, okay? But I want you to keep that at the back of your mind. Okay? So this is what I said. If you look at what happens if you were to reduce PTR, okay, which is part of RTE, okay, so we're talking about reducing PTR from 40 to 1 to 30 to 1, correct? Like I mean with regular teachers. But what we're seeing is that reducing that PTR with an extra contract teacher appears more effective at 1/5 of the cost than reducing that PTR with a regular teacher, but this difference is not significant, okay? So though the point estimate is bigger, they're at least no less effective. So now let's take a step back and think about why this might be the case, okay? Now, a contract teacher is different from a regular teacher in many ways, okay? It's not just the contract. They're called para-teachers, right? Because they're different in multiple ways. Age are younger, so they might be more enthusiastic, okay? They are from the village. So what might be the reasons? So the first is that you might just have greater intrinsic motivation because you're from the same community, okay? So Geeta Gandhi Kingdon has now done a bunch of very nice work in UP, right? I mean, showing how one of the problems of having a regular teacher salary be so high is that the social distance between the teacher and the taught in the villages is so large that the teacher is not in the same community as these kids, and the teacher comes in and goes back. And so if you belong to the same community, there's probably likely to be more of an intrinsic connection to the community. So that's the intrinsic motivation. But there's also greater extrinsic motivation simply because this is an annually renewable contract, okay? So we have in our data, we can see that the higher a teacher's absence is, the lower the probability of the contract being renewed is, okay? So there is certainly some correlation between between incentives for effort and whether or not your contract is renewed, okay? Which is again a non-trivial difference between these two types of teachers. And finally, it's just convenience, okay? You live much closer to the school. So I think the larger question to ask, okay, is that when you think about, it's worth taking a step back and thinking, actually, let me finish this next slide, okay? In many ways, this is probably the single most powerful slide in this presentation. And this is coming from ongoing work we're doing on private schools, right? I mean, on vouchers. We've collected very detailed data on private schools. So let's see what's going on. Are these teachers being exploited, okay? So this is the salary distribution by teacher type in government schools, okay? And notice, okay, this is your average government school teacher. The mode is about 10,000 rupees. And here this is, after some of the revisions, this is now between 2 and 2,500. Okay, so the factor difference continues to be 5. Now under this, we overlay on exactly the same scale the distribution of private school teacher salaries in the same villages. Okay? And that is the distribution of private school salaries. Notice that the highest paid private school teacher is paid less than the lowest paid government school teacher. There isn't even any common support between these two distributions. So it is not that the contract teacher is being exploited relative to this guy, but rather relative to the market. In fact, contract teacher gets even more, but this is how massive the rents are in the government sector jobs. Okay? Now, it's useful to take a step back and say, how are we in this bizarre world? Okay? Because if you talk in Delhi or Bombay or Hyderabad, people will say that nobody wants to join teaching. Okay? We need to increase salaries to attract better teachers. That teaching is not a respected profession. And here I am coming and telling you to reduce salaries. Well, that's what I'm telling you. But I'm just showing you, that there's this strange disconnect. Okay? In fact, my favorite parlor game to show how disconnected the policy-making elite in this country is with any reality is to pick up a random person in the IIC and ask them, what is the salary ratio between a typical government school teacher and a typical private school teacher? Okay? And I'm not kidding you, okay? Very famous people who I will not name, okay? Not only get this question wrong, but they get it wrong by a factor of 20. Okay? Because the most common answer is, private school teachers must be making about 1.5 times to 2 times the government school teacher. But that's because they're thinking about DPS and modern and Springdales and a completely rarefied universe that represents less than 0.1% of this country. Okay? If you go look at what the average numbers are, this is the average. Okay? So now the question is, how did we get into this kind of strange equilibrium? And I think there's many things going on, okay? But one non-trivial part of this is that salary negotiations take place in urban capitals with very high cost of living, okay? So if you say 15,000 rupees a month for a teacher in Delhi, that seems nothing, right? You say, how will the poor guy manage? But you take that same 15,000 rupees and go 200 kilometers out, it is now a fortune. And it is 10 times the market clearing wage, okay? So there is something here about and this is not something we have dealt with openly, and that's what the data is forcing us to do, is that the challenge of providing equal quality services in a cost-effective way in highly spatially differentiated conditions is a highly non-trivial problem. Okay? So if you think about teacher labor markets more broadly, and you say, here is my choice. Okay? Basic economic theory tells you that you employ factors of production till the ratio where the ratio of marginal product is equal to ratio of marginal cost. Okay? So the point here is that you can hire 4 or 5 private of these lower cost teachers in the villages, but hire more of them. Okay? And that's what the private school does, because the private school is closer to trying to optimize, right? Given the market conditions, and they hire more teachers, have smaller PTRs, but hire more of these less qualified teachers. Okay? So let me now move to performance pay. Okay? And in many ways, this is a part of the results that I think are probably the most generally relevant beyond just education, because, we talk about, you go to Bihar again, and I think the Chief Minister rightly says that his top 3 concerns are governance, governance, and governance. Okay? We're in this very strange situation in this country where we keep expanding the burdens on the state without doing anything to expand the capacity of the state. Okay? And everything creaks, and everybody has more work than what they can reasonably do. Nothing happens. And, you have a rights framework that says, okay, we'll hold you accountable. So now that guy's time is now spent even more in court as opposed to getting anything done. Okay, so we live in strange times. Okay, but the point is that if you think about governance, the most important frontline determinant of governance is the public sector worker who is transacting with the students, with the patients, if you're health workers, with the wage seekers, if you're an NREGA employee. So everything that the state is trying to do involves public employees. Okay? And the problem here, of course, is a complete disconnect between anything these guys do and what their professional trajectories look like. So, one of the most perverse findings in our teacher absence work was the teachers who reported the highest job satisfaction were the teachers who were the most absent. Now, normally you would think that, hey, the people who like their job, they're satisfied, these guys show up, they're motivated, okay? But you do the focus group discussions with teachers and it is very clear what is going on, right? Which is that the teachers who get away without showing up and get their salaries, they're very satisfied with their job, yeah? Life is good, okay? But the teachers who, for reasons of intrinsic motivation, are working hard, are the ones who are the most demotivated by the system, because they see, "Arey, main ek lota gharaun pe baith ke kaam kar raha hai," right? So it is a system that is doubly perverse, because not only are you allowing non-workers to get away, but also demotivate those who work. Okay. Now, there is a lot of literature in psychology and economics, for example, that talks about how external incentives can crowd out intrinsic motivation. But that takes place at a completely different margin. Okay? So if you read the psychology literature carefully, what you learn is that, yes, it is seen as demotivating if an external agency is trying to exert command and control over a domain of professional expertise. Okay? But if the external incentives or recognition is based on professionally accepted norms of what is good and what is bad, then in fact it increases intrinsic motivation. Because now there is a reason to work because that work is being recognized. Okay? So in many ways, I think the politically very important point about the framing of all of this is that at no point did we talk about this in terms of accountability, because then you've lost half the battle, right? Because then it's an adversarial relationship with the teacher unions and you'll never get started. Okay? But the entire point is that this was a program to recognize and reward outstanding teachers. Who are in the system, unsung heroes working hard. And there's nothing here that actually identifies and rewards them. Okay? So, from a research perspective, the questions you're trying to ask are, can teacher performance pay improve student outcomes? What, if any, are the negative consequences? Because there's a lot of research in organizational behavior that shows that you can have perverse outcomes from performance-linked pay, because the most basic problem is that if your bonuses are based on a measurable component of output, you might do well there, but neglect the non-measured components. Okay? So the classic example here is, if you're trying to incentivize factory workers to produce more, then, he might compromise on quality, right? Or he might compromise on machine maintenance, right? So there's a lot of work in organizational design in trying to deal with this. And so bottom line is, it's not obvious, okay, that bad things will not happen. It's easy. So in the context of education, the most common worry would just be teaching to the test. Okay? So are you getting a bunch of cramming and kids are not learning anything deep, but they're just cramming with it. Okay? You might be interested from an organizational behavior perspective, comparing group and individual incentives. Then you get into the black box of saying, how did teacher behavior change? What did they do in response to this program? And then, there's heterogeneity of different types of teachers. And finally, again, from a political economy perspective, what is teacher opinion? Okay, is this something that they would support? Okay. So this is probably the paper that is kind of the most detailed and well fleshed out and kind of well known. So I'm doing this in a little bit more detail. Okay, so let me talk about each of these concerns and highlight the importance of good design. Okay, so it's not enough just to say we'll do performance pay. You really have to think very, very carefully and design these things properly. Okay, so like I said, this I've already talked about. Okay, this was framed in terms of recognition and reward. Okay, then teaching to the test, it's much less of an issue here, given that if 60% of kids cannot read, right? Even if all you're doing is learning to do that, you're going to do better. But the other thing we do is we take this concern very seriously. And so what we do is the bonuses are based on your gains in mathematics and language, but we also go into a surprise test in science and social studies. Okay. Now, the surprise test is not meant for the bonus, but it is purely from a research perspective, okay, to see whether bad things happen on other dimensions. Okay. Similarly, we took the test design very seriously. So education initiatives, we work very closely with them to design these tests to have what we call mechanical versus conceptual learning. Okay. So my favorite example of this is you ask kids and teachers in fourth standard geometry, okay, do your kids understand area? And they'll all say, yes, humne padha hai, bachon ka aata hai. And then you give them 3 questions. You give them a rectangle, give them a triangle, and then you give them a house. Okay, but you put the same triangle on top of the same rectangle. Okay. And what you'll see is that less than 50% of kids who get both the rectangle and the triangle right will be able to do the house. Okay? And then you ask the kids why, and what's the answer? Humko formula nahi mala. We have not been taught the formula. Okay? So, which means that area to them is if you see a rectangle, you do length multiplied by breadth. If you see a triangle, you do half base multiplied by height. But the concept of an area as what is inside an enclosed space of a closed figure is something that they don't know. Okay? And even more striking example, multiplication. Okay? So you ask them 37 times 4. Now, again, only less than half the kids can do this, about 42% of kids can do this. Okay? And you'll see them when they do this. The way they do it is they've learned their tables by heart. Okay? So they'll say 4, 7, 28, 8, 2, 1, 48. Then you ask the same question like this. You say 37 plus 37 plus 37 plus 37 equals 37 multiplied by what? Okay. Now, in many ways, this is a much easier question, right? Because if you look at the chronological sequencing of skills, addition comes before multiplication. So all you have to do is count 4 and write 4. Right? But less than 7% of kids get this one right. And that's because A, they don't know the concept of multiplication as that of repeated addition. And B, if you change the format of the question, they're lost. Okay? So, but the point of what we were doing by taking this very seriously is having pairs of questions in the test paper that ask the same underlying pedagogical concept in both the ways that they are taught in the textbook, which would be mechanical, but then ask the same pedagogical concept in an unfamiliar way. Okay? So the larger point is the research point, which is to see that do you also see gains on conceptual questions. But a larger point is in the long run, you don't have to worry so much about teaching to the test if your test can get more creative over time. Okay? Now this is again a simple example of how it is so important to think about design events. Okay? So a very common and naive way of thinking about, we will reward teachers based on your average pass rate. Okay? So school mein 10th standard board leke average pass percentage ke dauran we'll give you your bonus. But this is obviously problematic, right? Because if it's based on pass rate, the teacher is not going to spend any time on the strongest kids because you're going to pass anyway. If he's not going to spend any time on the weak kids because jo bhi karna hai, fail hona hai tere ko. Okay? So, and you'll spend all your time like on the small fraction of kids in the middle. And in fact, there's research based on No Child Left Behind that shows that this is exactly what happened, right? That you get this inverted. Okay? Similarly, suppose I base this on the average gain. Okay? You might say, easiest way to increase the average is to make sure the weak children don't come for the testing, right? So then automatically average badhega. So you got to think about these things. And the answer is very simple, right? The answer is that any child who's in the baseline who doesn't show up is automatically scored as a 0. So you can never do worse than having a child drop out. Okay, so these are very simple tweaks. And similarly, your bonus is based on the average improvement of all the kids. And so for every child, you have a child-specific target that is linked to your baseline score. And so what you're trying to do is get improvements across the distribution, okay, and not just at parts of it. Now, finally, and if we were to scale this up, I mean, this is why I would be the first person to say this is nowhere ready for scale up, okay, because the fundamental issue in India is just integrity. How do you implement all of this, okay? Like, I mean, without automatically everybody copying everything and all the papers leaking, okay? And so, I'm the first person to agree, okay? Now, from the context of the project, this was not a problem, okay, because it's completely independently administered by the Premji Foundation. We have teams of 750 evaluators during this process. Of course, that's rounding error for Pratham, okay, like, but these are big numbers, and every class is independently proctored, like, I mean, this is done, and so it's not a problem, at least from the perspective of this study, okay? So, what are the outcomes? The outcomes is that you get a robust and positive gain, and by far the largest effects from the performance-based intervention. Okay? So one thing I didn't tell you is, like I said, the average bonus is only about 3,000 rupees a year per teacher. Okay? And when we started this, the salary was about 8,000 to 9,000, so it's about 3% of annual pay. Okay? And conditional on getting a bonus, it was about 4,500 rupees, because roughly 2/3 of teachers got it. Okay? Because another very important thing in design, which I didn't get into, there's issues about tournaments, piece rates. But, there are many programs in the US that say they didn't have any effect, but then you go and see how they were designed. They were designed either so that everybody got a bonus, or the threshold was set too high or too low. So you want to set your thresholds in a way that if very few people get it, then that is not enough to get effort across the distribution. If everybody gets it, then again, there's no differentiating effect. Okay? And the other critical thing to remember is this is not an increment. It is a bonus. Which means that you have to perform year after year after year to get it. It's not like you perform 1 year, you get your increment and chalo abhi khush hoke baith gaye. Right? So the entire point is to structure it so that continuous effort is being rewarded as opposed to one-offs. Okay? So the main results are that you get these big positive gains of 0.15 and then at the end of 2 years of 0.22 standard deviations. This is average across group and individual. I'll show you the individual is much bigger. And if I can get nerdy for a second, and for the econometricians and statisticians, what we see is that the treatment distribution, first order stochastically dominates the control distribution. And so what that means is basically nobody in a treatment school is worse off, okay, than a corresponding kid in a control school. So, because you might get an increase in the mean, but you might still have an increase in variance, which you might not be happy about. Okay, there is an increase in variance, but everybody's better. So, this is kind of mechanical conceptual, you see gains everywhere, and this is in many ways the biggest kind of most convincing finding, okay? Which is you also get significant improvements in science and social studies, okay? Even though there is no bonus on this whatsoever, okay? And then in the paper we do a lot of, we go look at the mechanisms of this, and you can break down the test scores into predicted scores and residuals. But bottom line is it looks like the mechanism for this is that if you're reading better, then you're automatically doing better in other subjects, even though there is no bonus on that whatsoever. Okay, so it's a very simple story of complementarities at very low levels of learning. Okay, now, I would be the first person to agree that in 12th standard creative writing, that teaching somebody a formulaic 5-paragraph essay, right, could crowd out a creative writing process. But that affects 0.1% of the distribution, or 2%, or 5% if you're lucky. But for the vast majority of the distribution, even improving basic reading and basic numeracy is giving you improvements at all parts of the distribution. Okay? So group versus individual, basically I'm going to go through this faster. And what we see is at the end of 1 year there's no difference, but at the end of 2 years, the individual starts beating the group. And then, in fact, there's a subset of schools that we followed for a longer time, and the individual completely trumps the group over time. Okay? Now, this is the one bad news. The one bad news, or, in some sense, it's not bad news, it's what happened, okay? This is the data, okay? You say, what is the mechanism? What happened? And after all this natak, we don't find a single difference in teacher absence. So teacher absence continues, that's why I'm calling it a gravitational constant, okay? The teacher absence stays at 26 to 27% in both the treatment and the control school, okay? It doesn't change. So the question is, where did these increases in test scores come from? Okay, what happened? And basically what happens is that teacher effort goes up, conditional on being present. Okay, so when you are there, teachers report more likely to give extra homework, extra classwork, conducting extra classes, extra practice tests, and they focus more on weaker children. Okay? Now, one concern you might have is if this is just teacher self-reports, it is just cheap talk, okay? How do I, koi bhi bol sakta hai, maine ye sab kiya, okay? So how do I verify that this is not just cheap talk? There are two things I can tell you. One is notice that nobody reports doing more than 50% of any of these things. Okay, so it's not like they feel pressure to say I'm doing all of this. But more importantly, I can correlate the teacher's stated response with their child's performance and value added. Okay, and in fact, you see that these stated responses are positively and significantly correlated with student learning trajectories. Okay, and once you put on again, think about this through the basic lens of incentive theory, it all makes sense. So Esther Duflo, they ran a famous experiment with cameras, right? I mean, where they put cameras in school based on, and paid teachers on the basis of attendance, okay? Now what they saw is that absence fell down, okay, but there was no change in teaching activity conditional on being present. So you put these two things together and you realize the power of basic economic theory, right? You put the incentive on attendance, you'll get attendance. You put the incentive on outcomes, you'll get the outcome. Now, from a teacher's perspective, this is optimal, okay? Because remember, the school is 12 kilometers away. So if my fixed cost of going to school is high, it makes sense to exert more effort once I'm there as opposed to going more, okay? So this is, I'm getting into more detail in this paper because this is something I really, really want to emphasize as a key takeaway, okay? What we do is, we're now looking at heterogeneity of effects, okay? Because so far I've told you only about average effects, okay? Is how do the effects vary by student and teacher characteristics? Now it turns out that there is not much difference as a function of student characteristics, but there are robust differences as a function of teacher characteristics. And the most interesting thing is this result, okay, on education and training. So these little bars are telling you, what is the typical effect of education and training in a typical controlled school? And you basically see there's no effect, okay? If anything, training is negatively correlated with learning outcomes. And that's because, the beard teacher, feels like teaching first class is not my job, okay? But in fact, all the correlational evidence suggests that more trained teachers, in fact, do slightly worse. But notice, though, that the better trained teachers are the ones who actually respond the best to the incentive program, okay? So what that tells you is that the training provides you the capacity to do better. But in a business as usual setting, you have no reason whatsoever to use that capacity. But when I give you a reason to use your capacity, a trained teacher does better. Okay, so it's very simple. Go back to what I told you. Quality is knowledge multiplied by effort, right? So when I increase my effort, you're going to see a bigger return where the knowledge was higher, right? So that's my point about the partial derivative of quality with respect to effort being equal to knowledge, right? So there's a very important point there, which is people keep saying, government school teachers are more qualified than private school teachers. That's true. But in every paper we've done, every piece of evidence we've looked at, I don't know if Pratham's done this kind of longitudinal work, but I have not found any case where teacher training is positively correlated, with learning outcomes. But that is the centerpiece of RTE, that we must have a trained teacher in every classroom. Now, this is not to say that training cannot be effective. This is not to say it cannot be effective. But training as it is done seems to have no effect whatsoever. Okay? So let me get to the end of what I'm doing and then just get to the political economy of this, which is the teacher opinion on performance pay is overwhelmingly positive. Okay? But 85% had favorable opinion, but 75% said the program increased their motivation, and about 67% said the government should consider implementing this. And the gap between these two is they say that as long as the foundation runs the program, we trust it. But if the government has to run it, then we're not so sure. Okay? But the important thing is that what we have demonstrated is a proof of concept, right? That a well-designed, transparently administered, transparently and fairly communicated program not only significantly improved outcomes, but was something that the teachers very strongly supported. Okay? Now, one thing people will say is, salaries are already so high, why do I need to pay bonuses on top of that? Okay? But that completely misses the point, right? Because the point is that performance does not depend on the level of pay. It depends on the structure of pay, right? And so we also ask the teachers how they would like in the context of, say, a pay commission increase, right? I mean, a 15% budget is there for pay increase, right? You can hold the overall amount constant and you just increase the spread, okay? So in a year, if you're supposed to get 5% DA across the board, you make it 2% across the board and the remaining 3% goes into a performance-linked pool, so the spread goes from 2 to 8%. Right? So then in the long run, the cost is not the fiscal cost of the bonus, because that is just another way of paying a salary. Right? The only cost is the administrative cost of actually setting up and running the system. Okay? So let's get to the punchline, okay, which is let's look at the summary. Now, I promise I did not intend for this thing to line up this way from incentives to inputs. Okay? But these were the 5 treatments, okay? And, the individual incentives were by far the most effective, and then the group, the contract teacher is basically the same as the group incentive, then the block grant, and then this diagnostic feedback. Okay? So the point here is, and of course I didn't have a chance to get into this, we calibrated this so we spent the same amount of money, okay, on every one of the treatments. So then, let's look at this. Oops, sorry, there is another slide which is not here, but you can see this in this bar. Okay, bottom line is we spent the same amount on everything. Okay, so then if you do this on a cost effectiveness basis, then you can see. But the story is even more dramatic than this. Remember that the contract teacher is as effective as the regular teacher at 1/5 the cost. Okay? So if you were to compare performance pay to the business as usual policy of hiring more regular teachers, it is about 20 times more cost effective. 20 times. Okay. Now, this is not to say that you will get that as a linear scaling up if you increase this. These are all marginal arguments, right? This is on the margin. But relative to the status quo, even doing a little bit in governance, and I'm defining performance pay as fundamentally governance, because this is about aligning your frontline workers' incentives with what the government is trying to do. You get a huge premium. Okay? So what I'm going to do is just summarize all of this into policy implications. Now, I recognize that I do not expect one set of studies, okay, however rigorous. I do not expect this by itself to become a blueprint for policy. Okay? There's one study, okay? But I think what it does illustrate is a bunch of concepts, okay? And the policy part of what I'm saying is based not just on our own work in AP, but looking at all the work that Pratham has done, a bunch of other studies that Esther, Abhijit, and Jaypal have done, other non-experimental studies. In fact, you could motivate this by an email that Rukmini sent out earlier this year, right? To a bunch of us who've been working in the economics of education, basically saying that there is now enough of a body of evidence along a bunch of studies, and that the policy dialogue is so disconnected from what we have learned that it is time to work actively to bridge that gap. Okay? So what I'm going to do in terms of policy is I recognize that in the end, policy making is a combination of technical inputs, administrative inputs, and political inputs. Right? So the technical input is only one part of the policy making process. So I'm not expecting this to drive it, but what would I do if I were running the system? Okay, I can have a view. And this is now in ascending order of political difficulty, okay, what I would say we need to do. Now the first is so blindingly obvious that you might think, did this guy really need to study this for 7 years to come and say that you need to focus on learning outcomes? Okay, but the reason I put this up here, okay, is if you go look at MHRD's RFD, okay, the RFD is the results framework document, and this is the document that the Cabinet Secretariat makes every department put out, saying that these are our goals for this year. Okay? That document, in some sense, is the strategy document for what the department wants to do. Okay? So it has access, equity, quality, all good things. Access has a weight of 18 to 20%. Equity has a weight of 18 to 20%. Quality has a weight of 27%. So you say, fantastic, wonderful. But then you go and look at the fine print, and you see that quality is perversely defined as more input. So what is quality? All teachers must be trained. So the definition of quality has been co-opted into something that a bureaucracy is comfortable doing, which is pushing more money down its chain. Okay? So the point about this is that in any system, what you measure is what you get. So Management 101 is if you have to set goals for the organization, and if the goal for the organization doesn't have learning outcomes, how are you going to get it? And the reason we need to absolutely be catalyzed into action is that graph I showed you, right? Because the spending pattern has been going up steadily. And see, in some sense, Pratham, right? I mean, their entire objective in doing these assay studies and having these highly publicized reports was really to hope and shock and awe, right? Like, the system into moving. But the Pratham assay reports have now become the new business as usual, right? Because another year, another Pratham report, oh, okay, kya kare? We are like this only. So in some sense, I think the point about really highlighting the power of what Pratham has done over 5 years is to put that longitudinal time series with the spending graph, right? Because the spending graph is this and the learning graph is this. So how can you with a straight face come back and say, give me even more money without at least trying to say that you're going to focus on outcomes? Okay? So that's point number one. It's management 101, but it's not governance 101. Okay? So that's why it's there. Now, but one thing I want to highlight, okay, and this then leads to my second point, is that the Pratham numbers are fantastic. Okay? Pratham numbers are fantastic in terms of an aggregate level diagnosis for the system. But it is not enough for what you really need to do to ensure child learning, right? Which is you then need to go look at this learning data at the child level. And while it might be infeasible for the system to track 300 million children, there is no reason why a teacher's work plan for a year should not actually include measuring and documenting learning levels of every student. And that then gets me to my second point, which is that it is absolutely critical to provide early stage remedial instruction to children who are falling behind. Okay? And, in a way, it is completely absurd to think about how we expect our system to run. Right? Because now that we've got this 5 years of data, we can document what are the correlates of variation in learning level. And what you see is that even when children enter class 1, there is a huge variation based on parental education and affluence and assets. Right? So, there's almost a 0.7 standard deviation gap in initial learning levels between a household where both parents have passed 10th standard and none have, and a household that scores 5 on an asset indicator index. So you've got children coming in with this huge variation, but the syllabus is marching at its own lockstep pace. And who writes the syllabus? The syllabus is again written by people who represent the top 2 or 3% of the population, and who are envisaging a rate of progress that assumes a certain amount of inputs in the home, a certain amount of cultural capital from the home, that simply doesn't exist. Now, mathematically speaking, you simply cannot expect these kids to catch up. Because not only is there this difference in initial level, there is this difference in gradient. So that, these inequalities are widening over time. And that is further widening because what's going on in the classroom is not catering to what's at the bottom of the distribution. So fundamentally, you have 3 options, okay? Either you'll say you'll have differentiated standards, but we don't like that because we think that's politically incorrect and we think everybody should aspire to high standards, and I agree with that. Or you say, you give children different amounts of time to reach the same absolute level, but we're not doing that because you're forcing everybody through the same rate. Or you say that from a first principles of social justice and equity, I am going to devote substantial additional resources to the weakest children in society and give them that additional leg up and additional helping hand to help them catch up early. Because otherwise, that flattening trajectory, that is the reality in our schools. Okay, so you just have to deal with this mathematical impossibility that not everybody is going to reach where they have to unless you go and deal with this very, very early. Okay, so that is point number 2. The third one is, and this is where I think, the contract teacher result. I don't want to get into the political fight of contract versus regular teacher. Okay, that is Digvijay Singh famously said that he thought he lost his elections in Madhya Pradesh because he tried to use more contract teachers. Okay, politicians are petrified of touching teachers' unions. Okay, so I don't want to go and say something about regular teachers. Let those norms stay. But I think what is politically feasible is the following. Is even regular teachers, if you go talk to teachers, okay, teachers in 5th class or 6th class, they will cry because they'll say half my children are not at the level that I can teach them. Because they will be the first people to tell you that if I try to transact the material in my textbook, I just don't know what to do because most of my kids are behind. So if this entire dialogue in education policy, even though I am the one who's done all this work on absence, okay, I don't want absence to drive the policy dialogue. I want the policy dialogue to be driven by learning outcomes. I want the policy dialogue to be driven by equality of opportunity and additional resources for disadvantaged children early on. Because this is something that even a union leader cannot look at this data and, he can't with a straight face say that nothing is wrong. Okay? So then you get into this deeper conversation and then they'll tell you, what can you do? I'm sitting in 6th class and what do I teach? I have to go through the syllabus because children are all over the place. Then we say, okay, why don't we support this process by providing you additional resources for the early stage remediation? And what better additional resource than a few additional contract teachers, at the village level. Now there are many studies, okay, what Pratham did with the Balsaki study, what we are learning, we're seeing what they've done with the remedial instruction. Teaching class 1, class 2, class 3 is not rocket science. An educated girl in the village with 10th or 12th pass is more than adequate to do this. Now, we're not going to get into this problem of treating them as teachers equal. No, because they are teachers' assistants, like who are working under regular teachers in a purely remedial fashion. But at the very least, that should be something that we should try and achieve, because the RTE is talking about certain norms of going from 40 to 1 and 30 to 1. Let all of that happen. So here's another way of thinking about our problem. The other big problem we have in primary education management in this country is this trade-off between access and scale. So we have prioritized putting a school within a kilometer of every habitation, okay, which is perhaps the right thing to do. But the consequence of that has been that you have the countryside pockmarked with subscale schools. So the average school now has 60 kids, 80 kids. In Himachal, I think the average school has 25 or 30 kids, because you put a school everywhere. So, but then if you have norms of 30 to 1, even with a norm of no single teacher school, you still have multi-grade teaching. You still have one teacher dealing with 3 grades or 4 grades. So you could easily imagine, keep your PTR norms of regular teachers, but allow schools to hire additional contract teachers that allows them to either eliminate multi-grade teaching or allow them to focus especially on remediation. Now, what we are doing now in Hyderabad, with the collector of Hyderabad, is trying to work out models of how to do this. So this is just a roadmap. It is organizations like Pratham who are in the field, who are constantly pressure testing models. That might be implementable and scalable. But the point here is to say, these are the mota-moti strategic issues facing education quality. And that if you don't directly focus on what is first order, you're going to miss the boat. Okay, now the last point is, see, I don't want to take the performance pay results and say that, oh, this is what you need to do. But you cannot manage an organization for results. You cannot manage it for professionalism if there is nothing in the life of your staff that depends on what they do. So at some level, this is the challenge of governance. Governance. Is for every department, every ministry, every part of government to think about, how do I get my HR policies right so that there is a performance-based career ladder that motivates people at all stages in their career. Right? So when Jack Welch was CEO of GE, he very famously said, I spent 70% of my time not thinking about company strategy. I spent 70% of my time thinking about HR. Because it's all about putting the right person in the right place and giving them the right long-term incentives to do what they have to do. Okay, so let me stop there. And I think, I've probably said a lot. But this is kind of my view of where we are based on what we've learned in the past 10 years. And trying to bring all this together in a way that simplifies and distills a high priority strategic message for education policy makers. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Karthik. I've heard you many times, but I think this was one of the most, I don't want to use the word moving, but it's really remarkable what your work has done. It's a great privilege to have a sense of the priorities you see ahead. And I wish we had policymakers who thought like you or listen to people like you. But for the moment, I want to call upon my co-conspirator in today's talk, Rukmini, longtime friend, and as passionate as Karthik is, driven both by her intellect but also by the amazing field presence of Masar and Pratham. Rukmini needs no introduction to this crowd. Dr. Banerjee is well known for her work. She's well known for many other things. And we hope very much to probe you on particularly this question which he raised in that email that Karthik referred to. We have all this evidence. The policy seems to be going in the opposite direction. Why? What did that
If only everybody learned as much as Karthik did in the last 10 years, we'd be a different country. Thank you, Shekhar, for actually hosting this and also allowing us to participate. I too have heard Karthik several times. I've heard this talk actually both by Karthik and also by his other team members. But the interesting thing is that it is such a rich, fertile field that every time I hear it, actually I hear new things as well. And one of my concerns has been that over the last, if you look at just India and sort of research and education and where policy is going, the last 5 or 6 years have been very interesting, and the next 5 or 6 years are going to be even more interesting. Because some of the things that we are trying to do, we will see different play in different states. And so it seems that there is both, Ramchandra Guha calls India a 50-50 country. Everything you see in Mumbai is 50-50. We are 50% democracy, we are 50% reading, we are, so on and so forth. And even as we look forward, I think that on the one hand, there is much more very, very well-done empirical evidence that is in front of us, generated by you, by many people in the audience and elsewhere, that's actually available right now, that wasn't in 2004 or 3. Our right to education, depending on which day you're reading it and what mood you're in, also provides sometimes really good opportunities if you really take the law seriously. And it's a law. It's not just a wish that people have. And how do we take these things and actually come to a more productive point than we've been, I think, is the real challenge. And I sent out an email some time ago to say that individually we all present our results. But I think putting it together, the landscape is a lot richer and can communicate a lot. So I think this is the beginning of some of these. And I particularly like Karthik these days a lot because, before he was too young. He's still here. Because he has studied Andhra Pradesh intensely, this way and that, as you can see, and now he's studying Bihar, and I'm from Bihar. But I think that, frankly, actually, this is not a joke, I think that given the movements that different states are making, in Hindi you say, बहुत सारे लोग हाथ पैर मार रहे हैं, बहुत सारे elections में, some of these are going to lead to some very interesting things. Yesterday and day before, was it 20th and 21st, 26 lakh people in Bihar sat for a teacher eligibility test. It's probably the biggest the biggest test that any adult has sat for, and they're going to recruit, 2 lakh teachers. And in the Bihar sort of circles, people are very concerned that 5 लोग देखेंगे, because इसी में से हमको लोग निकालने. So they are hoping that even if 70,000 people out of the 26 lakh pass well, then we have at least a beginning cadre. And I don't know how many of you, does anybody here want to be a teacher? Because I actually looked at the test thinking whether I should sit for the test or not. And then I thought if I fail, that would be really bad. But it's a test of actually some, content stuff. And again, I think it's how this whole thing pans out over the next 5 years, especially in states like Bihar, and people decide the fate of where we are headed. So I'm very glad Andhra Pradesh is a great state, but the action is going to be in some large states which have many of these, pieces that you've talked about coming together in perhaps different ways. I don't want to hold the audience, I think many people have questions for you, but I just want to point out, a couple of things that you made me think. The first intervention which didn't work is very interesting. And I think sometimes when things don't work, they're more interesting than things that do work. Because when they work, you want to move ahead with it. When they don't work, you have to look behind. Now, your stuff showed that you gave information to schools, it didn't work. Azim Premji Foundation, and I know there are some people here from the audience, did this big learning guarantee scheme, where also it was largely based on assessments leading to action. And it's also reminded me of the study that we did in Jaunpur, which was, also studied carefully, where we you gave information to government schools and expected action. We created village report cards, discussed it in big Gram Sabhas and expected action. In both places, there was no action. And in some way, this characterizes our policy debate. The 12th plan has been formed, there are lots of things being done, but there is no role there. In these cases, I think people are not even looking at evidence. But even if they did, I felt that they would, if you could do a randomized evaluation of the 12th plan planning process, and looked at giving information and giving other things, you probably find the same effect. And I think it raises fundamental questions about how do we deal with evidence in this country. how do we move from, anecdotes or our own experiences which are fueling, what the country should do next. And I think that, this is a much bigger question, and for several people in the audience, we've been having much longer discussions, that if you don't take evidence seriously, don't have methodological training, it is not a surprise that people come from the University of San Diego. I don't know where you studied in lower years, perhaps somewhere in Delhi, but there are people from MIT, people from San Diego, people from all kinds of places who are doing these, really very well done studies, and we have very few such studies which are happening here. And I think this is all part of it. We are not methodologically well trained, we're not attuned to evidence. And so as a larger group who presumably believes in evidence, what can we do over the next 5 years to both generate this evidence and actually also present it in ways. One of the things I really like about Karthik is you don't feel disadvantaged that you forgot whatever, I didn't even know a lot of things, but whatever I knew, I learned in my 1 year in Delhi school, I've forgotten long ago, and I can still understand what he says. And I think this communication of important findings in a way that most people can understand, I think is really important. In Nasser and Pratham, we spend a lot of time at the district level or block level, and I find that presenting interesting studies at the district level has much greater traction because it compels people to think, it compels people to have a question. If people don't agree with you, that's even better than if they agree with you, because then they have to formulate their own, kind of theory of change. And how do we do more of this? How do we get more Karthiks? I don't know if we can get more Karthiks, but how do we get more people having more discussions of this type at different levels outside of Delhi? I mean, Delhi is a good place, we all live here, but there's a big world outside that will lead to our digestion of evidence and thinking about it. So hopefully this is a beginning. I don't know if NCAER does, talks like this in regional languages and in district headquarters, but we'll be very happy, and I'm sure there are other people here who will be very happy to assist in taking, the not just the message, but I think the energy of the speakers, the whole enterprise, to move. So that was one. The other thing is, I think this whole, whenever I hear Karthik, I kind of agree with what he's saying, but I can also think of saying his, so one day I'm going to take his presentation and say it in a different way, and see if he agrees. I think that from a bunch of things that you're saying, you talk about contract teachers, but I'm thinking of several studies that we've been involved in, which look at, like the study that I was involved in with Gita Kingdom. We look at 3 types of teachers: the regular teacher, the para teacher, the private school teacher. And we did, the study was in UP and Bihar, but there are several types of para teachers. There were para teachers recruited in different ways. Now, in Andhra Pradesh, the para teachers look very different in terms of experience and training. In UP and Bihar, often the para teachers are better educated because they are younger, and so on. And the comparisons that we made, and we clearly need to do more, showed that the learning gains that even the private school teachers did was not that high. And so, one is that what kind of teacher, what does he need? We are going to invest a large amount of our country's resources in training. Training as it stands right now doesn't matter, but nobody wants to give up training altogether, because that's the only way in which you can influence teachers. The recent study, Karthik, that we've just done last tracks 900 schools. It's a non-experimental study, and 30,000 kids over 18 months. And there we found that the teachers' capability of answering some of this, regardless of their education, regardless of their training, of being able to do some of the 4th standard questions was evenly distributed, across training and education and age. So clearly we need to do different things in training, just like we need to do different things in the classroom. Your contract teachers performing well, and you have these 4 or 5 things that they reported on, to me points to the fact that, if I was to connect that with some of the studies that we've done, it would point to some black box that we need to unpack, which may be called process, or school organization, or things which are not just individual related. We see from the JPAN evaluations of our work that and this we see across the board. We've done, I think, 6 or 7 randomized evaluations on different parts of Pratham's work over the last 10 years, that the volunteer who's not even paid anything has an effect regardless of whether it's in Jaunpur, if it's in Champaran, if it is, no matter where it is, no matter what is the actual educational context, that this extra person spending time with kids, especially the weaker kids, has a big impact. And putting these studies together again is interesting because those guys are not paid anything. And those guys are much less trained than even your contract teachers. So where is this big effect coming from? And perhaps it's coming from a set of things that we are as yet not able to measure as well. But certainly I think that even looking at your graph, it looks like perhaps these guys are treating each child differently and teaching from where the child is at to where you need to take the child to be. The extra class, the focus on the weaker children, such things. So this brings me to the next thing of, there are levels above the school. There are decisions that schools can't take under our current circumstances. So if I want to, especially on curricular issues, supposing I want to not teach children in my school by grade. Our schools are organized as standard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The school usually is not empowered to take a decision to say, merge it all and teach it by kids who know and kids who don't know. This requires some support from a higher level. There's a whole higher level which goes, what level can certain organizational decisions be made that might improve the ability of the teacher right now to teach better because the way the kids are grouped is different. And I think that at some level you need to start, the problem with experimental work is that, even if you do it at the block level, you need to have 100 blocks at which you do things to be able to spin out some of these things. In the work that, I just want to end with one sort of story that Yamini and Anit and I were in Bihar. Bihar has just done the administrative reform. They've merged all the different silos of the district level so that there is now one district education officer, and he's the richest man in the country. He has some 400-500 crores to play with to improve what happens in his district. So, every education administrator from all the states which don't have money should rush to Bihar and vie for that post because you have the money and also you have the political will to bring about quite a lot of change. Now, what we did with this set of district education officers who have lots of experience, they're the most senior people in their own department, was to send them to schools, 4 of them went to school each, and say, what would you need to do with this school so that if you came back next year, the school would be different. And we calculated if you minus the experience that me or Anil or Yamini had, which is very few years, these guys had 100 years of experience going into the school, to plan to the school. And what was striking was, there were 2 things. One is everybody was quite humble. They came back saying, कि हमारे स्टेट में 70,000 स्कूल है, हर स्कूल को अलग-अलग से देखने की जरूरत है. That in itself, I think, is an admission that is, worth congratulating. But what was interesting is that people could not, these people, experienced people, could not kind of distinguish between things that need to be done at the local level, individual incentives, inputs, processes, decision making, versus how the system needs to support what happens at the school level. The situation needs so much work that you were unable to say that I need a certain policy, I need to empower a certain set of people, I need to give maybe a block grant to a whole district to say, take your SSA money for a year, I'm not even going to look at you, and let's see if you can achieve these outcomes. Versus at the school level what needs to be done. And I think that because of the nature of our research, we can only look at certain layers at a certain time. But the big challenge, I think, for people like you or people like us, is that how do we keep up generating questions and reasonable answers at a speed at which we need to move if we need to keep pace with the kinds of things that are happening on the ground. So I'm hoping that this is just a beginning of many such things, and I'm going to stop.
Yeah, so I think, Rukmini and I have been having some version of this conversation now for the past 6 or 7 months, and so I agree with pretty much everything. So let me just, add some thoughts that might be relevant to the broader discussion. I think this business about the gap between evidence and policy is, just absolutely first order. And one of what I'm hoping to do by coming and doing this in places like NCAER and, having people from EDSIL and others who engage with the system on a day-to-day basis is really just to hand over all my materials, right? I have no interest in kind of being the person who has to go present this because the research is done with public money. The results are there for the public good, and this is now the only reason we don't do this earlier is we wait for a peer review process, till we are confident about the results, and then only after that we go to town. So of course, ideally you would like me to come to you every 3 months or 6 months in real time, and there's a need I think there's a reason, different types of research have their role in society. I think the deeply reflective academic research that goes after things with minutiae, where, I mean, you don't see, for example, what all blood, sweat and toil goes behind this in terms of dealing with the referees who ask you about, where did the standard error in footnote number 42 come from. But that is the foundation on which this edifice is built, and that's not a foundation I would want to sacrifice, right? I mean, so I think we do have to, there is this spectrum from pure technical research that's policy relevant to people who are in more kind of action research roles, to people who are in think tanks, to people who are in consultative roles to government, on a regular basis, to kind of just absorb all of this on a regular basis and be able to constantly increase the extent to which the policy establishment has to deal with data. I mean, I think just doing that would be an enormous improvement over the status quo, right? I mean, and so I completely agree with you. In terms of that. So one thing I want to clarify was, the actions that I showed that teachers did differently, that was not the contract teacher. That was in the performance pay program, what the regular teachers did differently. So on the contract teachers, there is no reason to think that they did anything differently. And so fundamentally you're right, it's an extra body. Okay. Now in terms of the mechanism for that, I think you're exactly right. But see, what the research on class size shows, and this is also something that's highly relevant for RTE, is study after study after study on PTR shows that PTR matters the most for the youngest children. And that's because, see, if I'm lecturing to a group of adults, right, then, how much is my lecture twice as more effective when I lecture to 25 as opposed to 50? No, because everybody's there, it's a public good, and that's the lecture. So if you decide whether to cut class size from 50 to 25, it has to double productivity because you have to hire a second teacher, to accommodate the half class. So you've got to think about where the cost-return trade-off really shows up in class size, and what all the evidence shows is that when the children are very young and they're being socialized into the process of learning, when they're disruptive and running all over the place, that's when the class size matters a lot. So maybe the reason these additional helpers, maybe all that they're doing is reducing disruption, and providing a little bit more individual attention to focus what is going on. I think, the fact that you find these effects even when you don't pay them, I think is testimony to the power of the low social distance and the connection to the community and a sense of respect that you get from that. But I think, like somebody famously said in Human Resources 101, it's that money without praise is crass, but praise without money is cheap, So you need a little bit of both to sustain that. So you could think about what the contract teacher gets paid really as a stipend, something over and above that keeps this thing going. And I completely agree with you, right? That in some ways, the questions that we have addressed in this is a reflection of my training as an economist, and is a reflection of the fact that economists per se don't get into the black box of instruction, because that is something we think that education specialists should be doing. As economists, we think more about systemic resource allocation issues, and the relative cost effectiveness of different interventions, which is why we did this. But I've also spent a year in the faculty at the Harvard Education School, and so I absolutely, agree with the importance of doing within the black box research, which in some sense maybe economists can help inform or help evaluate. And so, if we were to design certain models of this reorganizing classroom or reorganizing teaching, I think I would absolutely work with you to kind of bring a certain amount of result to those evaluations. And I think this point you mentioned, again, I had breakfast with Yami, so we're talking about exactly the same thing, is even this ability to distinguish at what level things should be done, right? So Lang Pritchard had this masterful paper on this, right, where he basically broke down the education value chain into different functions and connected it to the first principles of fiscal federalism, which tell you at what level of aggregation different government functions should exist. And the basic trade-off is that when a function exists at a low level, you are able to better accommodate diversity and customize what needs to happen to local conditions. You are better able to respond to local information and things are more accountable. But the trade-off is you don't have economies of scale. So now, and when there are spillovers, that's a problem. So there are some functions for which you don't need every school to write a textbook. You don't need every school to come up with curricular standards. So there are some functions that very naturally ought to be performed at a higher scale, but other functions that very naturally make sense to do down. So if you could ask Land for his paper and PowerPoint and take back, next time you go down to talk to these guys. And I'm sure
Land's PowerPoints are only useful for him.
I happen to have kind of sponsored a particular PowerPoint that Lant gave in 2006, I guess, to the Planning Commission. And it's quite amazing thinking back on that, where he actually did what you just said, and talked about the contract teacher solution and how politically it might sell. And that's now 4 years back, and in some sense, we got more evidence, but we had some of those fundamental ideas even back then. So with that, let me stop this end of it and open it all out to anybody who has questions, and I'll just take them a few at a time and then